The transport ship carrying Ambassador Alina Harrison moved through the dark space toward the massive station that housed the Galactic Council, and she sat in her private cabin staring at the photograph in her hands, and the image showed a young woman with brown hair holding two small children, while a man stood beside them with his arm around her shoulders, and they were all smiling in front of a farmhouse on New Harmony, and Alina traced her finger over her daughter's face and felt the familiar ache in her chest that never truly went away, and it had been 6 months since the massacre, and 6 months since she had lost everything that mattered, and 6 months since humanity had learned that playing by the rules could get you killed. Door chimed, and Alina tucked the photo into her jacket pocket before calling out that the visitor could enter, and Captain Rebecca Torres walked in wearing her Earthfleet uniform with ribbons that told stories of battles fought and won, and Rebecca had been Alina's security chief for 3 years now, and the two women had developed a friendship built on shared grief because Rebecca had lost her brother and his entire family on New Harmony. Rebecca held out a datapad and told Alina that the Council had sent the official charges against Earth, and there were 17 separate violations of the Accords of Civilized warfare, and each one carried potential sanctions that could cripple human expansion into space, and Earth could be expelled from the galactic community, and human ships could be banned from using the trade routes, and colonies could be cut off from vital resources, and the list went on. And Annalena took the pad and scrolled through the charges without much interest. And she had expected this, and humanity had known there would be consequences when they decided to stop following the rules, but those rules had failed to protect New Harmony, and they had failed to protect the millions who died there, and so Earth had chosen survival over Rebecca, sat down across from Alina, and asked if she was ready for the hearing, and Alina nodded, and said she was as ready as she would ever be, and Rebecca pointed out that the Council species would not be sympathetic, and they had built their entire civilization on the Accords, and the idea that war could be fought with honor and restraint, and humanity was threatening that foundation. Alina looked at her friend and said that their civilization was built on a lie, and the Accords only worked if everyone followed them, and the Corellians had proven that not everyone would. And Rebecca agreed, but pointed out that the Council did not want to hear that, and they wanted humanity to apologize, and promise to follow the rules again, and return to being the junior species that did what it was told. The ambassador stood and walked to the window where she could see the Council station growing larger as they approached, and the structure was enormous and shaped like a flower, with dozens of petals extending from a central hub, and each petal housed the diplomatic quarters for different species, and the whole thing gleamed with lights that made it look beautiful and peaceful and utterly disconnected from the reality of what had happened on New Harmony. Rebecca joined her at the window, and the two women stood in silence for a moment before the captain spoke, and she said that the human fleet was ready, and if the Council tried to use force against Earth, then they would find out just how far humanity was willing to go. And Alina smiled grimly and said she hoped it would not come to that. But she was not optimistic, and the Council species had spent centuries believing that their way was the only civilized way, and they would not give up that belief. Easily the transport docked, and Alina and Rebecca made their way through the station corridors, and everywhere they went, other species stopped and stared, and some looked curious, and some looked hostile, and some looked afraid, and humanity had become unpredictable and dangerous, and the other species did not know how to handle that. And for thousands of years, the galactic community had operated on understood rules, and humanity had broken those rules, and now no one knew what would happen next. They reached the great chamber where the Council met, and it was a vast circular room with seating arranged in tiers that rose up toward a domed ceiling, and representatives from 40 species sat in their designated areas, and at the center of the room was a platform where those called to speak would stand. And Alina would stand there soon and defend her species' decision to abandon the Accords. Rebecca had to wait outside, because only ambassadors and council members were allowed in during formal hearings, and Alina walked alone down the long aisle toward the central platform, and she could feel every eye on her and hear the whispers that followed her. She kept her head up and her shoulders back, and she thought about her daughter and her grandchildren and all the others who had died while following the rules. She took her place on the platform and looked around at the assembled aliens, and there were so many different shapes and sizes and colors, and humanity was still new to this community and still learning. But all the species that filled the galaxy, and but one thing Alina had learned was that, despite their differences, they all believed in the Accords, and they all thought that war could be tamed and controlled and made civilized. The council speaker called the session to order, and she was a Viridian named Lissa, and her people looked like elves from human mythology, with pointed ears and impossibly graceful movements and silver hair that seemed to glow with its own light. And Lissa had been kind to Alina in the past and had expressed genuine sorrow over new harmony, but Alina knew that kindness would not save humanity from judgment. Today Lissa spoke in a voice that carried icily through the chamber, and she explained that they were gathered to address the actions of humanity following the tragedy at New Harmony. And while the council acknowledged that the Krellian attack had been a horrific violation of every principle they held dear, it did not justify humanity's response, and the wholesale destruction of the Krellian fleet without giving them any chance to surrender was itself a violation, and possibly a worse one because it was calculated and deliberate rather than the act of rogue. Commander Zelena listened and waited for her turn to speak, and she had prepared her arguments carefully, and she knew they would not be popular, but they were true, and sometimes truth mattered more than popularity. Another council member stood, and this was Commander Vera of the Zetharians, and her people had blue skin marked with patterns that glowed softly in the dim light, and Vera had always been fair in her dealings with humanity, but now she looked troubled as she addressed the chamber, and she said that humanity's actions had created a dangerous precedent. And if every species responded to betrayal by abandoning all restraint, then the galaxy would descend into chaos, and the AA Accords existed precisely to prevent such escalation. More council members spoke, and each one made similar points, and they understood that humanity was angry and grieving, but emotions could not be allowed to override the structures that kept civilization functioning, and Earth needed to recommit to the SE Accords and accept punishment for the violations and promise to follow the rules going forward. Finally, Lissa turned to Alina and invited her to address the council, and Alina stepped forward and began to speak, and her voice was steady and clear as she told them that she would not apologize, and humanity would not return to the Accords, and they had learned a painful lesson that the other species had apparently not learned. Yet she pulled out her datapad and displayed images of New Harmony before the attack, in green fields and small towns, and children playing in parks and research facilities where scientists worked to terraform the planet more efficiently, and it had been peaceful and beautiful and full of hope then. She showed what the Krellians had done, and the images were horrific, and cities reduced to molten craters, and forests burned to ash, and oceans boiled away, and 4 million bodies that would never be buried because there was nothing left to bury. And she let the council sit with those images while she spoke about how Governor Willis had followed every rule and surrendered exactly as the Accords required, and how the Krellians had acknowledged that surrender and then attacked anyway. Lena told them that this was not an isolated incident, and human intelligence had uncovered dozens of similar cases where the Krellians had used the Accords as a weapon, and they would demand surrender and wait for their victims to comply and then strike when defenses were down. And they had done this to multiple species and gotten away with it because the survivors were too scattered or too afraid to bring charges, and the council had failed in its duty to enforce its own rules. The chamber erupted in noise as species representatives argued with each other, and some demanded proof of Elena's claims, and some admitted they had heard similar stories, and some insisted that even if true, it did not justify humanity's response. And Lissa called for order, and it took several minutes for the chaos to die down. Alina continued speaking, and she said that humanity had tried to be good galactic citizens, and they had followed the Accords faithfully and believed that doing so would keep them safe, and New Harmony had proven them wrong, and 4 million dead humans had paid the price for that belief. And now Earth had made a different choice, and they would fight to survive, and they would not handicap themselves with rules that their enemies ignored. She finished by saying that humanity was withdrawing from the Accords, and any species that threatened human colonies would face immediate and overwhelming retaliation, and there would be no warnings and no chances to surrender and no mercy, and no mercy. Earth hoped that actual consequences might accomplish what pretty words had failed to do and create real peace. Instead of the illusion of civilization that the Accords provided, the silence that followed was heavy and complete, and Lena stood on the platform, meeting the eyes of species representatives who looked shocked and angry and afraid, and she had said what needed to be said, and now humanity would face whatever came next. The council chamber remained frozen in shocked silence after Alina finished speaking, and she could see the representatives processing what she had said, and some looked angry, while others appeared thoughtful, and a few seemed genuinely frightened at the prospect of humanity operating without the constraints that had governed galactic warfare for thousands of years. Lissa stood slowly, and her graceful movements seemed more deliberate than usual, as if she was buying time to collect her thoughts, and when she finally spoke, her melodic voice carried a note of deep concern, and she said that she understood humanity's pain, and the council had failed New Harmony, and that failure would haunt them all, but abandoning the Accords entirely was not the answer, and it would lead to a darker future for everyone. Lena remained on the platform and replied that the future could hardly be darker than watching 4 million people burn alive while following rules that were supposed to protect them, and Lissa flinched at the words, but pressed on, saying that individual tragedies, no matter how terrible, could not be allowed to destroy the framework that prevented universal catastrophe. A representative from the Korthon species stood up, and his people were stocky with thick gray skin and multiple arms, and his name was Brecken, and he had always been skeptical of humanity's place in the council, and now he spoke with barely contained anger, and he said that humans were proving they were too primitive and too violent to be trusted with space travel, and their withdrawal from the Accords was nothing more than an excuse to engage in the kind of barbaric warfare that civilized species had moved beyond. Lena turned to face him directly and asked how many Korthon colonies had been destroyed by species that used the Accords as a trap, and Brecken hesitated, and then admitted that the Krellians had hit 2 Korthon outposts in the past decade, and both times they had demanded surrender under the AA Accords, and both times they had attacked after the Korthon forces complied. The ambassador pressed her advantage and asked why the Korthon had not brought this to the council's attention, and Brecken's skin darkened with what Alina had learned was embarrassment in his species, and he said that bringing formal charges required evidence and testimony and survivors. And both outposts had been completely destroyed, and the Korthon government had decided it was better to reinforce their remaining colonies than to pursue justice that might never come. Alina spread her hands and addressed the entire chamber, and she said this was exactly the problem, and the Krellians had exploited the system perfectly, and they knew that demanding surrender under the Accords gave them a tactical advantage, and they knew that total destruction of the target meant no witnesses and no charges, and the council had built a system that rewarded the most ruthless players while punishing those who tried to follow the rules. Commander Vera stood again, and her bioluminescent patterns pulsed with agitation, and she said that Alina was not wrong about the flaws in the system, but the solution was to fix those flaws, and not to abandon the system entirely, and the Zetharians would support reforms to the Accords and stricter enforcement and real consequences for violations. But only if humanity agreed to remain part of the framework, though. Ambassador shook her head and said that humanity had no faith in reforms, and the council had known about Krellian violations for years and done nothing, and words and promises would not bring back the dead and would not protect future colonies and Earth. Needed concrete protection and not more diplomatic processes that might eventually lead to some kind of accountability. Lissa intervened and suggested a recess so that cooler heads could prevail, and Alina agreed, and she stepped down from the platform and walked back through the chamber while representatives whispered and argued around her, and Rebecca was waiting outside, and the 2 women headed toward the human diplomatic quarters without speaking until they were safely away from listening devices. Once they were alone, Rebecca asked how bad it had been, and Lena said it was about what she expected, and the council wanted humanity to back down and apologize and return to the Accords and pretend that everything would be fine if everyone just followed the rules better this time. And Rebecca made a disgusted sound and said that Earth Command had predicted this response and they had contingency plans. Ready Alina asked what kind of contingency plans, and Rebecca explained that human fleets were positioned near 3 major trade routes, and if the Council tried to impose sanctions or blockade Earth, then those fleets would shut down the routes. And it would cripple galactic commerce within weeks, and it was a gamble, because it might trigger a wider war, but Earth Command believed the Council's species would back down rather than fight. The ambassador sat down heavily and said she had hoped it would not come to threats and ultimatums, and Rebecca pointed out that the Council was already threatening humanity with sanctions and expulsion, and Earth was simply making it clear that humans would not go quietly. They spent the next several hours reviewing intelligence reports and preparing for the next session in human. Agents throughout the galaxy had been gathering information on Council military capabilities, and the results were interesting, and most Council species had small defensive fleets, and they relied on the Accords to prevent large-scale conflicts, and only a handful of species maintained offensive capabilities, and the Krellians had been one of those in humanity. I just eliminated them as a threat. Rebecca pulled up tactical assessments and said that in a straight fight, Earth could defeat any 3 Council species combined. And the human military had been designed for total war and not the limited engagements that the Accords allowed in decades of human history. Studying warfare and strategy gave them an advantage over species that had grown comfortable with Civilized. Rosalena asked if they were really considering going to war with the entire Galactic Council, and Rebecca said no one wanted that, but they needed to be prepared for it, and the message needed to be clear that humanity would not be bullied or sanctioned into submission. When the Council reconvened, Lissa opened by announcing that they had received reports confirming Elena's claims about Krellian violations, and multiple species had come forward with incidents they had not previously reported, and the pattern was undeniable, and the Krellians had systematically abused the Accords for at least 20 years. The Viridian ambassador looked tired as she continued, and said that the Council was prepared to posthumously condemn the Krellian Empire and strip them of their council seat, and implement reforms to prevent future abuses, and in return they asked that humanity reconsider withdrawal from the Accords and work with the Council to build a better system. Stood and thanked the Council for acknowledging the truth about the Krellians, but she pointed out that posthumous condemnation did nothing for new harmony. And reforms that came only after humanity forced the issue were not reassuring, and Earth's position remained unchanged. And they would not return to the Accords. Brecken stood again, and his multiple arms gestured angrily. And he said that humanity was being unreasonable, and the Council was offering compromise and reform, and Alina was refusing to meet them halfway, and this would end badly for him. Everyone, the ambassador replied that humanity had already met the Council more than halfway, and they had followed the Accords faithfully and buried 4 million people as a result, and now Earth was drawing a line, and if that made them unreasonable, then so be. A new voice spoke up, and this was Ambassador Thane. From the Breviks, and his people were small and covered in feathers, and they were known for being mediators and peacekeepers, and Thane suggested a middle path, and he proposed that humanity be allowed a temporary exemption from certain Accord provisions, while maintaining membership in the Council, and this would give Earth the security it needed while preserving the diplomatic framework. Alina considered this carefully and asked what kind of exemption Thane had in mind, and the Breviks explained that human forces could be allowed to use preemptive strikes against confirmed threats and bypass the usual surrender protocols in situations where there was evidence of Accord abuse, and in exchange humanity would submit to Council oversight and prove that each exemption was justified. It was a clever compromise, and it acknowledged that the Accords had failed while trying to maintain some structure, in Alina said she would need to consult with Earth's command before giving an answer. And Lissa agreed to another recess, and the Council dispersed. Rebecca and Alina returned to their quarters and opened a secure channel to Earth and Fleet. Admiral Jackson appeared on the screen, and he listened to Alina's summary of the situation, and then asked for her assessment, and she said that Thane's proposal was better than nothing, but it still required trusting the Council to fairly judge human actions, and that trust had been broken. Jackson nodded and said that Earth's command had discussed various scenarios, and they were willing to consider the exemption approach, but only with strict conditions, and humanity needed the right to withdraw immediately if the council proved biased in their oversight, and they needed guarantees that human colonies would not face sanctions. While these cases were being reviewed, and they needed the exemption to apply to all defensive actions, and not just preemptive strikes, Lena said. She would present these conditions, and Jackson told her to make it clear that this was Earth's final offer, and if the council rejected it, then humanity would proceed with full withdrawal and accept whatever consequences came. And he also mentioned that Admiral Brooks had moved the Third Fleet into position near the Vander trade route, and just in case diplomacy failed. Ambassador returned to the council chamber and presented Earth's conditions, and the debate that followed was intense. And some species argued that humanity was asking for too much, and others pointed out that the alternative was complete withdrawal and potential conflict. And Lissa worked tirelessly to build consensus and find language that both sides could accept after hours of negotiation, they reached an agreement, and humanity would receive a provisional exemption from specific accord articles related to surrender protocols and preemptive defense, and a joint oversight committee would review human military actions, and but humans would have representation on that committee, and decisions would require unanimous agreement and not simple majority. And this meant that Earth could veto any finding against them, and which effectively gave humanity the freedom they wanted while maintaining the appearance of council oversight. It was not perfect, but it was workable, and Alina accepted on behalf of Earth, and the council voted to approve the compromise, and 32 species voted yes, and 8 voted no, and Brecken and the Korthon delegation abstained as. The session ended. Lissa approached Alina privately, and the Viridian looked exhausted. And she said that she hoped this compromise would hold, and the council needed humanity, and but humanity needed to remember that civilization was fragile and easy to destroy and hard to rebuild. Lena met her eyes and said that New Harmony taught humanity that lesson already, and they had learned what happened when you trusted civilization to protect you, and now they would protect themselves and hope that was enough. 3 months after the council compromise, Alina found herself aboard the human battleship Defiance as it patrolled the outer colonies, and she had requested this assignment because sitting in an office on Earth or the council station felt wrong when human settlements were still vulnerable, and Admiral Brooks had been happy to accommodate her. And the Defiance was one of Earth's newest warships, and it carried enough firepower to level a planet, Captain Rebecca Torres commanded the ship, and she ran a tight operation, and the crew respected her because she led from the front and never asked them to do anything she would not do herself. And Alina had watched Rebecca transform from a security chief into a true naval commander, and grief had made them both harder and more focused. The ship was currently near the colony of New Devon. It was a mining outpost with 15,000 people and rich deposits of rare metals. That made it valuable and potentially a target, and human intelligence suggested that the remnants of the Krellian Empire were regrouping and looking for soft targets to hit, and New Devon fit that profile. Lena stood on the bridge watching the sensor displays, and Rebecca sat in the command chair reviewing tactical reports, and the crew worked quietly at their stations, and everyone knew that things could go bad quickly out here. And they were ready. A sensor technician named Amy called out that they had multiple contacts entering the system, and Rebecca asked for details, and Amy reported 6 ships and Krellian signatures and moving in formation toward New Devon, and their weapons were hot, and they were not broadcasting any diplomatic signals. The captain ordered battle stations, and alarms sounded throughout the ship, and crew members rushed to their positions, and the Defiance powered up its weapons and raised shields and moved to intercept the Krellian vessels, and Rebecca opened a channel to New Devon and warned them to initiate evacuation protocols. Felt her heart rate increase, and this was it, and this was the first test of whether humanity's new approach would work or lead to disaster, and she watched as the distance between the two forces decreased, and the Krellians showed no sign of slowing or altering course. Rebecca ordered her communications officer to hail the Krellian ships, and the officer tried but received no response, and the enemy vessels continued their approach, and it was clear they intended to attack the colony, and Amy reported that the Krellians were charging weapons, and Rebecca made her decision. The captain ordered an immediate attack, and the Defiance launched missiles and fired railguns. And the human weapons crossed the distance in seconds and struck the Antikrellian formation, and 2 enemy ships exploded instantly and a third took heavy damage and began venting atmosphere, and the remaining 3 scattered and tried to return fire, but the Defiance was faster and more advanced, and Rebecca maneuvered the ship with precision, and the human railguns tore through Krellian shields and armor, and within minutes, all 6 enemy vessels were destroyed, and debris spread across the system. And New Devon was safe. Bridge crew cheered, and Rebecca ordered them to stay focused and scan for additional threats, and Alina let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, and it had worked, and the Krellians had come expecting an easy target following Accord protocols, and instead they'd run into a human warship that shot first and asked questions, never Admiral. Brooks contacted them from Fleet Command and congratulated Rebecca on the victory, and asked for a full report, and Rebecca provided the details and explained that the Krellians had refused communication and approached with weapons hot and all. Evidence suggested they intended to attack the colony, and Brooks said he would forward the report to the Oversight Committee, but he doubted there would be any issues since the tactical situation was clear. I knew he was right, and this was exactly the kind of scenario the exemption was designed to cover, and humanity had protected a colony from an obvious threat, and the Council would have no grounds to object over. The following week, similar incidents occurred across human space, and Krellian remnant forces kept trying to hit vulnerable colonies, and they kept running into human warships that destroyed them without hesitation, and word spread quickly through the galaxy, and species that might have considered testing humanity's resolve thought better of it. The Oversight Committee met regularly to review human military actions, and the Earth representatives presented clear evidence for each engagement and showed sensor logs and communication attempts and tactical assessments, and the other committee members had little choice but to approve the actions as justified, and after a while the meetings became routine and formality, but not everyone in the Council was happy with the arrangement, and Brecken and several other species representatives began pushing for restrictions on the exemption, and they argued that humanity was becoming too aggressive, and that preemptive strikes were being used too freely, and they wanted stricter definitions of what constituted a legitimate threat. Lissa tried to mediate, and she acknowledged the concerns, but pointed out that human actions had demonstrably protected colonies from real attacks, and there had been no incidents of humans striking neutral or peaceful vessels, and the system was working as intended. Lena attended one of these council sessions, and she listened to Brecken make his case, and he showed statistics about the number of Krellian ships destroyed by human forces, and argued that this level of violence was excessive, and that humanity should be attempting to capture enemy vessels and take prisoners rather than destroying everything. They encountered the ambassador stood and responded that Brecken was welcome to explain to New Devon's 15,000 colonists why they should have waited for the Krellian ships to fire first before defending themselves, or perhaps he could explain to the 4 million dead on New Harmony why humanity should show mercy to an enemy that had shown them none. Brecken's skin darkened, and he said that Elena was being deliberately inflammatory, and that legitimate concerns about human military doctrine should not be dismissed with emotional appeals, and Elena replied that there was nothing emotional about wanting to survive, and that if the Korthon had taken a harder stance against the Krellians years ago, then maybe New Harmony would still be standing. The debate grew heated, and other species representatives took sides, and some supported humanity's approach while others worried about the precedent being set. Lissa eventually called for order and proposed that the Oversight Committee conduct a comprehensive review of human military actions over the past 3 months and present findings to the full Council. The review took 6 weeks and involved detailed analysis of every engagement, and the committee examined sensor logs and communication records and tactical decisions, and they interviewed ship captains and colony administrators and intelligence officers, and when they finally presented their findings, the results were clear. Out of 47 separate military actions initiated by human forces, 45 were unanimously approved as justified defensive operations, and 2 were classified as questionable but not violations, and these involve situations where the threat level was ambiguous in humanity. had erred on the side of caution, and the committee recommended clearer guidelines for future similar scenarios. Presented these findings to the council and said that the evidence showed humanity was acting in good faith and using the exemption appropriately, and the system of oversight was working, and she recommended that the provisional exemption be made permanent with minor adjustments to address the two questionable cases. The vote was closer this time, and 25 species approved, and 12 rejected, and 3 abstained, and the exemption became permanent policy, and humanity had successfully changed how the galactic community approached warfare, and at least for themselves, Alina returned to Earth after the vote, and she met with government officials and military leaders to discuss what came next, and humanity had won the diplomatic battle. But the war was not over, and Krellian remnants still posed a threat, and other species might decide to test human resolve, and Earth needed to remain vigilant. She also visited the memorial that had been built for New Harmony, and it stood in the capital city and consisted of 4 million lights, and one for each person who had died, and at night the lights formed a constellation that could be seen from orbit, and Alina stood there and looked at her daughter's name engraved on the central monument, and she wondered if any of this had been worth. A voice behind her spoke, and it was Admiral Brooks, and he stood beside her and looked at the lights, said that what they had accomplished would save lives, and the council would think twice before allowing another New Harmony in future colonies would be safer because humanity had refused to be victims. Lena asked if he really believed that, and Brooks said he had to believe it, and because otherwise all the death and sacrifice meant nothing, and they had to trust that standing up for themselves and refusing to follow rules that got people killed was the right choice, even if it meant becoming something harder and less idealistic than they had been before. The ambassador nodded and said she hoped he was right, and they stood together in silence, watching the lights flicker like stars and remembering the people who had paid the price for humanity's education and galactic politics. Back on the council station, Commander Vera met with Lissa in private, and the Zetherian's bioluminescent patterns pulsed with concern, and she said that humanity's exemption was creating ripples in 3 other species had approached her asking about similar arrangements, and they saw how effectively humans had protected their colonies, and they wanted the same freedom to act without accord restrictions. Lisa leaned back in her chair, and her silver hair seemed dimmer than usual, and she said this was what she had feared, and that humanity's actions would inspire others to abandon the framework. And Vera agreed, but pointed out that humanity had also exposed real flaws in the accords, and perhaps other species had legitimate grievances. Tootha, Viridian ambassador, asked what Vera would recommend, and the Zitharian said they needed to be honest about the fact that the old system was broken, and the accords had been built on assumptions that no longer held true, and species like the Krellians had proven that honor systems only worked when everyone had honor, and enforcement mechanisms were necessary. Lissa said that this meant fundamentally restructuring the council's approach to warfare, and Vera nodded and said yes, and it meant accepting that civilization was not about following rules, and it was about protecting people, and sometimes that required being willing to break rules that did not serve their purpose anymore. The 2 women sat in thoughtful silence, and outside the window stars glittered in the endless dark, and somewhere out there human ships patrolled their territory with weapons ready and orders to shoot first. And it was not the galaxy either of them had hoped to live in, but it was the galaxy they had, and they would have to make the best of it. Alina received word that her presence was requested at a diplomatic function, and representatives from multiple species wanted to discuss security arrangements, and she recognized this as the beginning of the next phase in humanity had changed the rules for themselves, and now others wanted to know if those changes could apply to them. Tushi prepared for the meetings and knew that whatever happened next would shape the galaxy for generations, and New Harmony had been a tragedy. But it had also been a catalyst, and humanity had refused to be destroyed by it, and instead they had used it to demand change and force the council to face uncomfortable truths, whether that change would make the galaxy safer or more dangerous remained to be seen. But Alina knew one thing with certainty, and humanity would never again trust their survival to rules that other species could ignore, and they would never again follow civilization to their own destruction, and if that made them barbarians in the eyes of some, then so be it. And barbarians at least had the advantage of staying alive 6 months after the permanent exemption was granted. Alina found herself in an unexpected meeting with 3 species representatives who had requested a private discussion away from the council chambers, and they met in a secure conference room that the Zitharians provided. And the representatives were Ambassador Kira from the Talviks, and Commander Vera, who Alina knew well, and Minister Jalan from the Parixis Talviks, were a species that looked almost human except for their golden eyes and slight build. And they controlled a cluster of colonies along the frontier, and Kira was young for an ambassador, and she carried herself with nervous energy, and the Parix were aquatic beings who used environmental suits when meeting air breathers, and Jolan's suit was ornate and decorated with symbols that Alina had learned represented military honors. Kira opened the discussion by thanking Alina for meeting with them, and then she got straight to the point and said that her people were impressed with how humanity handled the Krellian threat, and the Talviks had their own problems with pirates and raiders who used Accord protocols as cover for attacks, and they wanted to know if humanity would be willing to share tactical information. Alina asked what kind of tactical information, and Vera interjected that these species were trying to understand how to protect themselves without formally requesting exemptions from the Accords, and they feared that asking the Council would trigger political battles they could not win, but they needed to defend their colonists. Translator rendered his aquatic vocalizations into standard speech, and he explained that the Parix had lost 2 underwater research stations to raiders in the past year, and both times the attackers had sent surrender demands under the Accords, and the Parix had complied, and the attackers had destroyed the stations anyway and taken the research data and killed the scientists. The ambassador listened carefully and asked why they had not brought this. The council and Kira said they had tried, but the evidence was circumstantial, and the raiders had been careful to leave no clear proof of who they were, and the council had expressed sympathy but taken no action. And meanwhile, more Talviks outposts were at risk. Alina sat back and considered the situation, and she understood what they were asking, and they wanted humanity to help them fight without following rules that got their people killed, but she also knew that Earth's relationship with the Council was delicate, and openly helping other species subvert the Accords could trigger serious consequences. She asked what their governments officially wanted, and Vera smiled slightly and said that officially their governments knew nothing about this meeting, and if asked, they would deny any knowledge, and these 3 representatives were operating on their own initiative and seeking advice from a friend. The use of the word friend was interesting, and Alina and Vera had developed mutual respect over the past months, but this was the first time the Zitharian had suggested anything beyond professional courtesy, and Alina asked directly what would happen if she agreed to help, and Vera said that their species would be safer and humanity would have allies who understood why the old rules no longer worked, and that might matter in future council debates. Kira added that the Talviks had considerable mining operations, and they produced materials that human shipyards needed, and an informal alliance would benefit both sides. And Jalan mentioned that Parix scientists were experts in several fields where humanity was still learning, and knowledge sharing could advance both civilizations. It was a carefully constructed offer, and military cooperation wrapped in economic and scientific benefits. Alina said she would need to consult with Earth's command before committing to anything, but she was willing to present their request. And the 3 representatives agreed, and they exchanged secure communication codes and ended the meeting. Alina contacted Admiral Brooks through encrypted channels and explained the situation, and Brooks listened without interrupting, and then said that this was inevitable, and other species had been watching to see if humanity's approach worked, and now they wanted to copy it, and the question was whether Earth wanted allies in this or preferred to stand alone. The Admiral said that Fleet Command had already discussed this possibility, and they had developed a proposal called the Mutual Defense Initiative, and it would be a coalition of species who agreed to certain military protocols that prioritized survival over Accord compliance, and members would share intelligence and tactical information and coordinate defenses, and most importantly, they would support each other politically in the Council. Alina asked if this would not just create a rival power block that would fracture the galactic community, and Brooks acknowledged that risk but pointed out that the community was already fractured and the Accords had created a system where some species thrived by exploiting others, and a coalition of the exploited might force real reform. She agreed to present the proposal to the three representatives, and they met again 2 days later, and Alina outlined the Mutual Defense Initiative and explained that humanity was willing to share tactical doctrine and intelligence, resources, and coordinate military actions, and in exchange, the member species would support each other in council votes and present a united front on security issues. Kira asked if this meant leaving the council entirely, and Alina said no, and the coalition would operate within council structures but would refuse to follow Accord provisions that endangered their people, and they would use the same exemption framework that humanity had established and apply it collectively. Vera pointed out that the council would resist this strongly, and it would be seen as a direct challenge to their authority, and Alina agreed, but said the alternative was watching more colonies burn while following rules that did not protect anyone, and the coalition would at least give vulnerable species a chance to survive. Jolin asked how many species humanity hoped to recruit, and Admiral Brooks appeared on a holographic display and said that initial assessments suggested at least 12 species would be interested, and these were mostly frontier worlds and newer council members and species that had suffered losses to raiders and pirates and aggressive neighbors, and together they would represent a significant voting bloc and substantial economic power. The three representatives asked for time to consult with their governments, and Brooks said that humanity understood this was a major decision, but time was limited, and intelligence suggested that raider attacks were increasing, and waiting too long could mean more tragedies over the next month. Alina became the unofficial coordinator for what was quietly being called the Frontier Alliance, and 8 species joined the initial discussions, and each brought their own concerns and priorities, and the negotiations were complex because everyone wanted protection, but no one wanted to trigger a full confrontation with the council establishment. The breakthrough came when Commander Vera convinced the Zetharian government to officially endorse the Mutual Defense Initiative, and the Zetharians were a respected council member with a long history of peacekeeping, and their support gave the project legitimacy, and other species felt safer joining. Once Vera's people had committed when the Frontier Alliance formally announced its existence, the council reaction was explosive, and Lissa called an emergency session and demanded an explanation, and Alina stood before the assembled representatives and calmly explained that the alliance was a defensive cooperation agreement, and members would continue participating in the council and following most Accord provisions, but they would jointly claim the same exemptions that humanity already had. Brecken was furious, and he accused Alina of undermining galactic civilization and creating a military bloc that threatened peace, and Alina replied that what threatened peace was allowing raiders and pirates to hide behind Accord protocols while attacking innocent colonies, and the alliance existed because the council had failed to protect its vulnerable members. The Korthon representative said that this was exactly what he had warned about, and that humanity's exemption would lead to the collapse of the entire framework, and now 12 species were abandoning the Accords, and soon it would be 20, and then 30, and eventually there would be no structure left. Lessa looked exhausted as she tried to moderate the debate, and she suggested that perhaps the council needed to acknowledge that the security needs of frontier species were different from those of core worlds, and maybe a modified framework could accommodate both groups. Alina seized on this and proposed that the council formally recognized 2 categories of membership: and core members, who would follow traditional Accords, and frontier members, who would operate under modified rules that allowed more defensive flexibility, and both groups would maintain council representation and participate in decision-making, but military protocols would differ. The proposal triggered weeks of intense negotiation, and core world species wanted guarantees that frontier members would not abuse their freedom, and frontier species wanted assurance that core worlds would provide support when needed, and the economic implications were debated, and territorial boundaries were discussed, and military coordination protocols were drafted. Finally, they reached a compromise called the Dual Framework Agreement, and it officially recognized that species faced different threat environments and required different defensive capabilities, and frontier members could claim exemptions similar to humanity's original arrangement, and core members would maintain traditional Accord compliance in a new Joint Security Committee to coordinate responses to large-scale threats. The vote to approve the dual framework was 28 in favor and 9 against, and 3 abstained, and the Galactic Council had fundamentally changed because humanity refused to accept rules that got their people killed. Elena knew that not everyone was happy with the outcome, and some species felt that civilization had been weakened, but she believed that facing reality made them stronger and not weaker. And the old system had been built on comfortable lies, and the new framework, at least, acknowledged uncomfortable truth. She received a message from Admiral Brooks, congratulating her on the diplomatic victory, and he mentioned that Fleet Command was already coordinating with Alliance members on joint training exercises and intelligence sharing, and several joint patrol zones had been established in early. Results showed significant reduction in raider activity. Rebecca contacted her as well, and the captain said that the Defiance had just completed a joint operation with Talvix and Zitherian vessels to clear out a pirate base, and the cooperation had been excellent, and the 3 crews had worked together seamlessly, and Rebecca believed this kind of partnership would become standard in frontier space. Elena allowed herself a moment of satisfaction, and they had accomplished something important and changed the galaxy in meaningful ways, and New Harmony's sacrifice had led to reforms that would save countless lives, but she also knew the work was not finished. Lisa requested a private meeting, and the Viridian ambassador looked older. Then Elena remembered, and she said that the past year had aged her considerably, and watching the council system she had devoted her life to transform so drastically had been painful, but she admitted that Elena had been right about the flaws. In the old Accords, the human ambassador said that she took no pleasure in being right, and she would have preferred a galaxy where the Accords actually worked and where following the rules kept people safe. And Lissa agreed, but said that perhaps this new system was better, and it was certainly more honest. They discussed the future, and Lisa worried that the divide between core and frontier members would eventually split the council entirely, and Elena acknowledged the risk, but pointed out that the alternative was core worlds making rules for frontier species without understanding or caring about their security needs, and that path also led to fracture. The Viridian said that she hoped Elena was right, and that the dual framework would hold, and she admitted that Viridian colonies had already started requesting reclassification as frontier members so they could access the defensive exemptions, and this suggested that even core species recognized the value of the new approach. Elena smiled and said that maybe in time everyone would adopt frontier protocols and the old Accords would fade away naturally, and Lissa laughed softly and said that would certainly be ironic, but perhaps it was inevitable, and rules that did not reflect reality could not last forever. 1 year after New Harmony burned, Elena stood at the dedication ceremony for the first Joint Military Academy, established by the Frontier Alliance, and it was located on a neutral station between human and Zitherian space, and cadets from 12 different species would train together and learn tactics that prioritize survival over tradition, and the curriculum had been designed by human military advisors working with Alliance partners Admiral Brooks. He gave the opening speech, and he talked about how warfare had changed and how the galaxy had changed, and he said that the cadets who graduated from this academy would be prepared for reality and not for the comfortable fiction that civilized warfare was somehow less brutal than any other kind, and they would learn to protect their people first and worry about political approval second. Elena watched young officers from various species standing at attention, and she wondered what kind of galaxy they would build and whether the changes humanity had forced would make things better or just different, and she thought about her daughter and grandchildren